Happy Feast Week, Hoops fans, and welcome back to another episode of the House of Hoosier here on the Field of 68 Podcast Network. Just a few days away for Thanksgiving. That does not mean there is no Indiana basketball because arguably the biggest games of 2024 in this first half of the non-conference play are about to happen as the Hoosiers get ready, are already in Atlantis, and today we'll battle Louisville at noon alongside Ian Plaskoff. I'm Austin Platt. We'll have a former IU student, former Inside the Hall writer, and now Louisville radio host William McDermott on later to kind of preview that game and obviously what the Indiana's outlook is. But we're here to kind of just go over the last two games. It's obviously been a quieter few weeks around IU basketball with the kind of the lack of games there have been. Indiana only 4 games so far, but still a perfect 4 for 4. And we're here to kind of digest what happened in the South Carolina UNC-Greensboro game. Then obviously look ahead to just talk about how important this battle for Atlantis is for IU's resume. But Ian, how you doing? A few days here before Thanksgiving. We're finally no more classes to worry about for this next week.
Oh, it's a great feeling. Having nothing to worry about is something you really take for granted, especially as a college student. Good to be home in a different setting here, which is, a good change of pace. But Thanksgiving is always one of my favorite holidays to get together with everybody, and I always like the food too. So it's a good week.
And it's called Feast Week for a reason. There's just so much good basketball on, and glad to have IU as a part of it. The last time we talked, well, we did that quick recap video. If you guys didn't see on our social media, recapping that UNC Greensboro game, that ugly 11-point win. I guess let's start there, and then we can go back to South Carolina for a moment. But obviously, you win both of these games, but UNC Greensboro, a much tougher opponent. Indiana really just, I think my biggest takeaway from these two games is just Indiana's inability to pull away. And it felt like in the most part, Indiana, almost in airplane mode, or you're just kind of just cruising on cruise control. They're on autopilot, and then when they hit turbulence, they're like, "Oh, what do we do here in the last 4 minutes?" And finally have to make the plays to win this game. But kind of the box score maybe doesn't tell the entire story of how the game went.
Yeah, absolutely. I just haven't seen a complete 40-minute performance out of Indiana yet this year. I mean, things were looking really good against UNC-G when the Hoosiers were up, what, 19-5 at the first media timeout. And then it was like 21-9, and then from then on it was just kind of stay afloat. It wasn't really play to win, it was kind of play not to lose. Um, and if it wasn't for Bryson Tucker in that second half, I do think Indiana could have lost that game against UNC-G. Myles Rice again coming up big offensively, but just terrible shooting numbers. 41% from the field, 26% from three. Free throws were good, 14 of 16. But turnovers and rebounding were my two biggest issues apart from shooting. Indiana gave up 17 offensive rebounds to a UNC-G team that is, one, not that tall, and two, not that big in the paint. Um, and then also turned the ball over 14 times. So it is a bye game. It is kind of a tune-up game, if you will, but it's not a promising sign, and it's going to have to get fixed before Atlantis for sure.
Yeah, I think it's just the biggest issue so far has just been the lack of rebounding, and this was an Indiana team last year that I think on the boards finished last year with a net of zero. Like could not out rebound your opponent, and with the size that Indiana usually has on the floor, the advantages. That's just a huge concern for me. Yes, 17 offensive rebounds against UNC-G. They gave up 13 against South Carolina. This is a South Carolina team that was even arguably even worse than UNC-G coming into it in terms of the rebounding and how poor they had been. So it's just the biggest issue I have so far. But obviously, one of the positives you mentioned Tucker, who's looked good, especially in the second half of these games. But Myles Rice combined for 43 points in those two games really has shown what he can do. Not only, taking those jumpers inside the arc, which is kind of what we're used to, and it's sometimes reminiscent of Jalen Hood-Schifino's abilities. Maybe it's just because of the number one and the shots that he can create inside the arc. But in those two combined games, 7 of 10, or rather 5 of 10 from beyond the arc, which you're more than happy to take from a point guard who's not necessarily known for his abilities beyond the arc. But Rice has just taken a huge jump in these two games, and it proves how deep this IU team really is.
Yeah, it's really important because your point guard is what starts everything for you offensively. And in the first couple games when Myles Rice wasn't playing too well, Indiana had to rely on Mackenzie Mbako, Malik Reneau, all the guys from last year. But in a game like this against UNC-G, especially where Mbako and Reneau had off nights, I think Mbako was 2 for 11 from the field, something like that. It's just a luxury to have a point guard that can do it all himself and also get other guys involved when it may not be the primary guy's night. So when Rice can turn into that primary guy, it just kind of gives you a second wind if you're Indiana's offense. And it's definitely helped Indiana win a couple games so far. I expect it to do that throughout the season.
He's just such a huge addition for the backcourt, and Tucker has added obviously some really good contributions off the bench as well. In that UNC-G game, I mean, we've talked about how the big three of Mbako, Ballo, and Reneau, those guys all had 9 points, so really not a great performance down low, and it feels like at times Indiana is not being creative enough to get those guys the basketball, especially the big guys down low, and just when that double comes, especially that backside help that Indiana really with Ball and Renew haven't had the right passes to make, and feels like at times it's a little too predictable to go inside and to know when Indiana is going to almost force feed the big guy down low. And I just think that in years past we've seen that, and opponents are starting to figure out how to really limit that pass inside.
I haven't seen a lot of passing, period. I've seen a lot of dribbling and a lot of, ISO ball. And when there is passing, it feels like it's always just around the perimeter. The ball doesn't really get down low quick enough for my liking, at least, to make something happen down low. Um, and I mean, this team is designed to be able to do a bunch of different things and be dynamic and have the ability to work the offense differently. Um, and I mean, let's put this into perspective as well. This Indiana team is still the 14th ranked team in the country and they're undefeated right now. So it's not like it's the end of the world. But some people may like to see Ballo and Renew and the guys down low get a bit more involved. We're not seeing too many shot attempts from Ballo. Against UNC-G, he had 5 field goal attempts. South Carolina, only 2. But again, Indiana won those games. And this isn't like past years where you have to feed Khalil Ware, you have to feed Trace Jackson Davis in order to stay afloat and win basketball games. They have other guys that can do that too. So while it may be nice to have them involved down low, I don't see it as the end of the world when they're not getting all the production that some people may like.
You mentioned the passing, and that's something that has just been a concern. I think Renew has become a better passer, and Ballo needs to take that jump that we saw Trace Jackson Davis make from kind of his second year under, or his first year under Woodson to his second and that final year before obviously he went off to the NBA. And it feels like we just need to see a little bit more of that from especially Ballo. Although he did have 11 rebounds against UNC-G, brought down 13 against South Carolina. So definitely on the glass, he may gets off to some slow starts at times, but he's still been cleaning the glass quite nicely, and that's obviously with Renew on the court most of the time as well to potentially take some rebounds away from him. But I mean, the bench depth really, other than Tucker, has been a tiny bit concerning. I know not everyone has been healthy. Newton's been out. Cups has been out. Leo was healthy for the UNC-G game, but didn't get to see the court. And Luke Goody has really struggled from beyond the arc so far, though did see a big one go down. So it still feels like we haven't seen, obviously, this team completely healthy. And we've always said you got to take these bye games with a grain of salt, especially when you're winning them by double digits. Indiana has done that in all 4 games, which is what we have asked. So it still feels like right now we're not seeing the full potential of IU. Hopefully this week is when we will see maybe Indiana at its best.
Well, this is going to be when we're going to have to see Indiana at its best because this is the make or break of the non-conference schedule. This is where they have previously scheduled their games to get help with their resume come March. Now, back to your comment about the bench depth, Trey Galloway still not fully healthy, only 15 minutes in the last game against UNC-G. While he has played well in other games throughout the season, it wasn't his best performance, obviously, against UNC-G, still dealing with that. Luke Goody is getting good looks from the perimeter. Mike Woodson talked about this in the press conference. He was asked about Luke Goody's production, and he just kind of met that answer with he's getting the looks. They'll go down at some point. So he's going to keep feeding Luke Goody the ball. They'll go in at some point. But he did make a big one to go into the timeout with some momentum. I think it was the under eight in the second half against UNC-G. But the bench has really been led by Bryson Tucker. He has been the most consistent player off the bench, and he's really been the only consistently productive player off the bench. You don't see much out of Hatton. You don't see much out of Goody at the moment. And Galloway's still getting healthy, so take that with a grain of salt. But there's still some things to figure out with this bench. And then, of course, Gabe Cupps and Ja'Kai Newton's still injured, so they're kind of question marks as well, but I don't expect them to have much of a role. Um, but Indiana's been relying heavy on the starters, which has been expected. But I don't think they can maintain that throughout the whole year. So we'll have to see what happens in Atlantis. I think they'll handle some things differently because of the stake of these games. Um, but you don't really know right now.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll find a little bit more out after these next three games. Something that we talked about with Ben last time, but that was before the South Carolina game. Was just what was I going to say? Oh, the just the minutes that everyone is getting, and the schedule that Indiana has, just the amount of days off they've had between these four games. It's been just you having 4 to 5 days off, and then now you're playing three games in 3 days, which is obviously such a big turnaround and something that gets you ready for something like the Big Ten tournament when Indiana hopes to be getting that double bye and playing Friday, Saturday, Sunday, all the way to the Big Ten championship. So just to see how this team responds game after game after game with a noon game, and then they'll be playing, I think, later or maybe at the same time, hopefully at the same time on Thanksgiving Day, and then it'll be either 3 or 5:30 on Black Friday, either hopefully in the championship or that consolation third place game. So just to see how this team responds, because last year the Empire Classic we saw them get really beaten badly. They got blown out by UConn and then came back and narrowly escaped an upset loss against Louisville. So just seeing what three games look like in the span of 72-ish hours is something that I'm really curious to see.
And I think this is where having all these options comes in really helpful because, I mean, you mentioned the Empire Classic, and that team was not built to play three games in 3 days. They just did not have, if Ware had an off night or Renew had an off night, it was pretty much over by then. Um, but this year, I mean, we've seen what happens when different guys have off nights. We've seen off nights from Rice, we've seen them from Renew, from Mbako, and Indiana's still been able to win. Now 3 games in 3 days is different than 4 games in what, 2, 3 weeks. So it'll be a different look for sure. And then also something that I've been thinking about with all these neutral site games, especially in Atlantis, is the depth perception for shooters because while Assembly Hall doesn't have much behind the basket, it's kind of similar to these venues. A ballroom is completely different than any arena. So I would like to see what happens with the shooters. That goes for both teams because we know Indiana struggles with defending the three at points. Um, so that's another factor to take in for Atlantis. But there's a lot of question marks for this tournament. Like you mentioned about stamina and how this team's going to respond after the off days, but also the on-court differences playing in a ballroom, playing in a neutral site. Um, a lot of interesting things to find out that I don't necessarily have an answer for right now.
We always see these games usually have lower scores, which I guess in the sense of Indiana usually works out. Indiana's kind of the team that'll be happy to play those, high 50s, low 60s, maybe even into the 70s. But kind of once you get to the high 70s, you don't really favor IU. And I just think the way the defense has looked, especially in these first four games, has been promising, and the offense has kind of been on and off at times. But for the most part, other than the rebounding, I think the defense overall has been very good. So that obviously favors you, especially in some of these grinded out games when you're going to be beaten down, you're going to be tired. I think this defense should prove that they have enough to keep them in these games. And obviously it's easy to look ahead, but a potential top five matchup with Gonzaga could be on Thanksgiving Day, and maybe a matchup with maybe Arizona or Oklahoma is potentially on the horizon as well. I know Oklahoma has not been very good to start this year. I think they're down 7 spots in the latest AP poll. They've lost twice. And so that wasn't the matchup maybe that we were hoping for, but getting Gonzaga potentially on that second day would go a long way. I guess obviously there's only three ranked teams in this field, Indiana being one of them, obviously. Just kind of what do you need to see resume wise? Does Indiana need to see two ranked teams? Do they need to keep it close with Gonzaga? I'm curious kind of what your thoughts are for what the resume should look like after this week.
I think a positive takeaway from this tournament would be a win over Louisville for sure. Move into that second round, and that would be against the winner of Gonzaga and Virginia. So likely, or West Virginia, I should say, I believe. And then that would likely be a matchup with Gonzaga. In a perfect world, Indiana would beat Gonzaga, and that would be a massive piece for the resume. Um, but with college basketball being so focused on computer rankings at the end of the year, you'd like to keep that one close at least. And then if they are to lose that, play in that third place game with a solid team like Providence or Arizona. I don't know how the bracket I don't have it in front of me. So um you'd like to get two quality wins in this, I would think. In a perfect world, you'd like to go undefeated and win the whole thing, but the world's not perfect. So keep it close against Gonzaga in that second round, beat Louisville, and win that third place game. That'd be a good thing for me.
Yeah, just kind of going through the computer numbers right now. I'm on KenPom at the moment. Gonzaga at number two right now in KenPom. Louisville is at 57, so obviously Indiana will get a top 60, so not quite a quad one game to start, but obviously everything can change as the season goes on. Indiana right now is at 39th, so on paper they should have the edge over Louisville, and then if let's say Providence, who could be a potential third place, third four in that 3-4 game, that consolation game. They're 5-0 right now in the Big East, but sitting at 72nd. And I think Oklahoma is, yeah, they're a little bit they're at 47. So it's kind of a lot of the teams in the top 100, and the hope is you get three top 75, top 100 teams, which is the way it should be in this kind of marquee tournament. There's so many good games this week that there's so many good matchups, and easy to overlook one or two teams, but and then Davidson's that other team that they could potentially play, and they're in their hundreds out of the A10. So you're hoping that no matter what happens, Indiana plays the best team next. So I mean, even if that means losing. You just want to see what they look like against some of the top teams, and everyone talks about strength of schedule with the football team and the college football playoff conversations, and obviously that goes into the numbers rankings with net and KenPom. So obviously Indiana's strength of schedule is going to get boosted big time with these three games, and hopefully it's just all against three of the top teams. You mentioned it. The hope is you get Gonzaga and Arizona in the next two games in some way. So that's kind of just what we're looking for. I want to see how the team looks fatigue wise. You mentioned the depth of this bench. I think is going to go a long way. We're going to need to see Tucker step up. We're going to need to see Galloway play like he has at his best, and hopefully Goody can knock down some shots. These games are always lower scoring, which you're right. The viewpoint will change. I know we watched the women play a few games in Atlantis, and in that last game which was Monday, they did not look good offensively. So you just kind of you figure that as the games go on, that third game, potentially the championship, the shooting may not be at its best. So you're going to need that bench to step up big time.
Yep. These tournaments are always there are so many factors that go into them, travel and difference of times for some teams and just the venue. Um, you just the atmosphere is also something to take into consideration as well. It's going to be what, like 2,000, 3,000 seats in there as well. Um, they always make for an entertaining product, and the Maui spoiled us last night and throughout the day yesterday, and I'm hoping that Atlantis will be similar to that. But on the topic of strength of schedule, I think this is where we can make a lot of SEC fans happy and talk about quality losses as well. Because that may be the most common word that I heard this weekend, with the SEC having some troubles and then Indiana going down to Ohio State, uh, and losing that. Um, a quality loss to Gonzaga in this tournament or Arizona in the championship would not be the worst thing in the world for Indiana. Ideally, you'd like to win, obviously. Um, but with computer rankings, that loss is going to be a loss to a high quality quad one team. It'll boost the strength of schedule and then it will help the resume to some extent. Now, another thing that I'd like to say is that while it was an exhibition, Indiana's win over Tennessee was treated like a regular season game, and that is the toughest test that we've seen Indiana in this season so far, even though it was an exhibition. Tennessee is up there with the Gonzagas and the Arizonas. They're a solid team every year. And Louisville lost by, I believe, 20 to them. So that's a common opponent kind of look that you can get there for that first game. That's about all we have right now. Um, but this Indiana team is capable of beating good teams because they are a good team, to be honest. They're a number 14 team in the country. Um, and they're going to be one of the top three teams in this tournament. So the expectations have been high all year. They're going to be high into this tournament. Um, because Indiana is supposed to be good. So if they don't play well, then those expectations will not be met because we've seen them beat good teams. We know they can. They just have to do it again.
Yeah, hope is that that same thing can happen, and just keeping games in single digits should go a long way. And I just think that, even the win against UNC-G, getting it to an 11-point win, I think stands out a lot more than it being nine. So that those 2 points, I think, can go a long way in the computer rankings. For those of you that remember, obviously Indiana was in the Maui back in 2020, and I pulled up that bracket. Obviously, that was so much different with COVID, and it was much later than usual. It was the week after Thanksgiving. But Indiana beat Providence, a team they could play in this year's tournament. They beat them by it was by 20 points in the first game. Then they lost to Texas 66-44 in that second game, and then took care of business, a double-digit win against Stanford in the third place game. But played one of the top teams in that field, and you're kind of thinking about the same thing, and you're just hoping that the offense can show more than they did in that second game, like it was now 4 years ago, which is crazy to think about. Obviously, that was under Archie Miller, and a lot of things have changed since then. But I think what would be Galloway would be the only one that would have experience, right, from that,
Yeah, I think so.
that is currently on this IU roster. So he hope maybe his experience will go a long way. But any other thoughts before we kick it to William and start previewing this IU Louisville game?
I'm gonna continue what I say every episode. Don't overreact. It's game five. It's gonna be game five, six, and seven of the season. Plenty of time left. The expectations, yeah, they're high, but there are a lot of good teams in this tournament. I think Indiana can make some noise, but well, only time will tell. So should be a fun couple games of basketball. I'm excited to watch, and as the college basketball world kind of takes over the world of college athletics as football is starting to come to an end, um, we're in for a treat.
We truly are, and considering how crummy the NFL games are on Thanksgiving Day, basketball is definitely on everyone's mind right now, especially in the college landscape. So enjoy Feast Week, and now we'll kick it over to our interview with William to talk more about IU Louisville. All right, we are back here on the House of Hoosier podcast, joined now alongside William McDermott, formerly of Inside the Hall and WIUX, IU grad, who is now the radio host for Louisville Athletics on Louisville Radio for men's basketball and football. Derm, how you doing, man?
I'm good, Austin. Happy Thanksgiving. It's a really busy time. It's a very exciting time for a lot of reasons, and I love talking IU basketball and just basketball in general. Can't wait.
I know this is like the 35th podcast you've been on this week, so you're the true five-star recruit here for everyone talking cards and Hoosiers basketball. We should throw some NIL money at you.
I'd love that. Hey, hey, Austin can give you my email or my number, reach out to him. I'd love that. No, I mean, when I saw that this game was on the schedule, I figured that it would be a busy time. But I can't wait. I think it's going to be a really fun matchup. And just, I mean, I love Feast Week. I love, the Maui Invitationals going on right now. Yesterday was awesome for that tournament. It was just super exciting. So there's tons to talk about.
There always is, and I guess to get started, well, first off, okay, who are you rooting for on Wednesday? Let's get
No
this in
rooting
play.
interest, no rooting interest. I'm just gonna show up, do my job, and then the game will decide itself.
All right, fair enough, fair enough. All right, Louisville here, 3-1 on the season. Obviously had that 20 plus point loss to Tennessee, but have since then kind of just like IU, gone about business. They've won their games by a big margin. So I guess what could you take away from that Tennessee game, and kind of what else have you seen so far as 3-1 kind of seems like the record everyone expected?
Yeah, I mean, when they announced the schedule, they added that Tennessee game, and I think, with that game being so early in the season, you don't want to make too many broad judgments about the team based off that performance. It was a game where clearly they were a little overmatched. And I look back and I compare it to when Indiana went on the road, played Tennessee in an exhibition, and granted that is an exhibition. But you can definitely take a few things from both of those performances when comparing them. But when you look at Louisville overall for how they've performed under a first year head coach and Pat Kelsey, it's a program that under Kenny Payne massively underachieved. And he's done a really solid job, Austin. He really has at getting some energy back behind this program that really needed that jolt. So they scheduled the Tennessee game, and I think in part that was to do that, to kind of get fans showing up, get people excited early on in the season. They did not perform well. And I think, one problem that Louisville has had, and they did have in that game, is they are attempting, I believe, the second most three-pointers per field goal attempts in the country. And that is a pretty staggering margin, but as a team, they're shooting under 30% from three on the season. And in that game against Tennessee, I think they only attempted 10 layups at the rim. And that's kind of where this team is lacking. They don't have a post presence really. They like to play five out. And in a way, it's going to be really interesting to see how IU and Mike Woodson in particular deals with the rotations, because I don't know if they can play Umar Ballo, 30 minutes against Louisville, a team where he's going to have to be out on the perimeter a lot defensively and with the tempo. So it's going to be really interesting to see. But to answer your question, Louisville early this season, I don't think there's too much you can take away from the Tennessee game. They shot very poorly. Remember, this is a completely new roster, but it's a very experienced roster. It's top 10 in experience in the Division One, with a lot of transfers coming in from schools that were on NCAA tournament squads last season. So this is a team that's not going to be intimidated by Indiana. Um, Certainly, though, the matchup it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
We've talked about this many times that the way you beat Indiana is you kind of just shoot the lights out. And we've seen in past years in non-conference play, you can beat IU by just beating them behind the arc. And Indiana's defense so far this year has looked pretty good. There are still some spells where teams are getting second chance opportunities, turning those into three-pointers. But Indiana so far has shot the ball well from beyond the arc. But obviously, containing Louisville, a team where five guys already averaging in double figures. One of them being Chucky Hepburn, the Wisconsin transfer. I still can't believe he's playing college basketball at this rate. But I guess just matchup wise, how is Louisville going to match up against IU with the two bigs, and how is Indiana going to make sure that Louisville doesn't run them off the floor?
Louisville is going to have a tough time defensively with Renew and Ballo. I think it'll be an issue for them. They have James Scott has started every game at center for them. He's 6'10 or 6'11, but he's real wiry. He's not 260 pounds like Omar Ballo is, right? So physically, Indiana, if they're able to set the tone from a physicality perspective, rebound the basketball, which I know has been, a kind of a seesaw problem for Indiana. Some games they can rebound really well, but the UNC-G game really disappointing on the glass. I look there for a key for this matchup. But it'll be interesting because I can see a world where Louisville is hitting shots, right? They're making threes, but Indiana's getting whatever they want down low. Um, the one thing you mentioned, Chucky Hepburn, he's such a good perimeter defender that if Louisville can hound Cannon, Carlisle, Trey Galloway, Myles Rice, Indiana's guards, they're going to have a chance to just slow down the offense. It'll take longer to get the ball in the post. Things will just take longer to develop. It'll be harder to get in the screen and roll actions that Mike Woodson likes to do. That's where Louisville has a chance defensively. I still think, I mean, Indiana, I think they'll outscore Louisville by 10 in the paint. I mean, I just think, and that's kind of been a trend for even the games where Louisville into some of their bye games, they last played Winthrop on Friday and struggled a little bit. Winthrop, a solid group of five team, or not group of five, but mid-major team.
Football
This
mode.
isn't football. Yeah. Um, they have struggled on the glass. So I think if Indiana can take advantage of the glass, especially offensively, and just with the sheer size advantage that we've kind of talked about, that's how Indiana is going to be able to perform on that end of the floor. But defensively, I mean, this is a five out Pat Kelsey led team. They're going to shoot a lot of threes. They're going to want to get out and run. I mentioned the 3-point rate. I just, you mentioned Indiana's kind of tradition of it's known that players can get hot against them and guys can go off. And I think if Louisville starts to see some shots go in early, especially from beyond the arc, it's going to be difficult for Indiana to keep up points wise and scoring the basketball wise. So I think I'm really curious to see how Mike Woodson handles the Umar Ballo minutes, and how much he really is able to be on the floor with Renew. I think you can put Ballo out there, but I think you would have to have Mbako in the front court at the four just in order to spread the floor and matchup wise defensively. Because off the bench, Louisville has Case and Pryor, 6'10" forward who can really he's kind of an interesting player. He's not your traditional big at all. He can handle the basketball, but he's a little reckless. He can turn the ball over, but he's aggressive. And when he gets downhill and he's able to get to his spots, it opens up his 3-point shot. And Umar Bala is not going to be able to guard him, out on the perimeter when his shot is falling. So I think getting off to a good start is going to be big for both teams.
Yeah, you go back to a year ago, and these teams essentially met at MSG in the Empire Classic. I mean, Indiana was down, and the whole
The
zone.
zone defense, yep.
Kenny Payne, what's intrigued
Yeah.
me with the zone, and that's essentially what got Indiana over the finish line. You know, just talking about the threes, Louisville is making 10 of them at a 30% clip. So they're averaging 34 attempted threes a
Yeah.
game, which is just crazy.
Yeah, and they have guys that can make them. I think the percentages, and Pat Kelsey said this something similar on his press conference today. He's not worried about the percentage, and I'm not either. I think it'll end up evening out. They just had some games, and that Tennessee game, for instance, where just nothing was going in. I mean, I think they shot less than 30% from the field in that game, and they weren't able to get to the foul line either. So they have guys. Rain Smith comes over from with Pat Kelsey from College of Charleston. He attempted over 200 threes last year and made over 100. And he's well on his way to matching that pace. He's already attempted 40 threes. So and he's a 40% shooter. They have guys that can knock them down. Noah Waterman, transferred from BYU, is a good shooter. He hasn't shot the ball well to start the season, but he comes in as a guy that can stretch the floor and make them. I mentioned prior, Terrence Edwards Jr., Sun Belt Player of the Year at James Madison. They really need him to carry some of the scoring load. And he has in the games that they won. He didn't play well against Tennessee, though. But again, I the I'm not worried about the percentages. I think it'll even out for Louisville. Um, and in particular for Indiana, they've ran into some problems in the past with teams that are able to kind of move the ball quickly, drive and kick, in particular the overhelping and the nail slot rim defense that Mike Woodson runs. Again, if Rain Smith comes out there, I mean, Chucky Hepburn, he's capable from distance. I mean, everybody on the floor is going to be able to shoot except for James Scott when he's on the floor. So matchup wise for Indiana, they're really going to have to run them off the 3-point line, be aggressive on closeouts, not fall for pump fakes. And I'm excited. I'm really excited to see how both of the coaches kind of deal with these adjustments in game based off how the game starts.
You mentioned 5 out is something that Indiana has struggled with. I think of Iowa's sometimes with Fran McCaffrey's team, they just shoot threes, and Indiana couldn't figure out a way to get the ball inside successfully. And
Or, those Shrewsbury Penn State teams
yeah,
a
the
couple
booty
years ago,
ball.
especially. Yeah, I mean, Mike Woodson he had no answer for their ability to drive and kick the ball out for three. And the Nebraska, Hoiberg's teams, Woodson really struggles with them stylistically, and trends would say that he would struggle with a team like Louisville as well.
It's a good way to put it. And we've seen Indiana at times, even with size advantages, kind of be unable to get the ball inside. But the point guards that have played well as of late. Rice has had two 20-plus point games. How does Louisville try and slow him down with the way he can pass the ball if he's smart with it and doesn't turn it over and selfless? How do you slow him down?
Well, Chucky Hepburn is one of the better perimeter defenders in the conference in the ACC. He was when he was at Wisconsin in the Big Ten. That's going to be a really fun matchup between the two. And I compare it. I mean, we saw how well Rice played at Tennessee. And yes, it's an exhibition, but Zakai Ziegler was the SEC Defensive Player of the Year. And Myles Rice had his way with him. So I think if you're Indiana, you do feel good that Rice can be productive against Hepburn. But for Louisville, certainly a key is the perimeter defense. Chucky Hepburn, 11th in the country in steal percentage. As a team, I think I have KenPom pulled up. Maybe not. No, I don't. But Louisville is in the top 10 in the nation when it comes to forcing turnovers percentage wise for opponents' possessions, especially non-steal turnover percentage. They do a really good job at defending without fouling. It is something that has been a key for them early on. And we haven't seen that against solid competition besides the Tennessee game, and they struggled, right? So it's the sample size is not much to work off of, but Hepburn is the head of the snake defensively, and he's a handful. It's funnily enough, Terrence Edwards Jr., when he was at JMU, he played against Chucky Hepburn in the first round of the NCAA tournament last year. That Wisconsin James Madison, I think it was a 5-12 matchup. And Terrence said that, just having Chucky guard him, it was like hell. I mean, it just so savvy, scrappy defensively, a little bit undersized, but great hands, has a knack for getting the ball, predicting, moves and stuff. It'll be a really fun matchup to watch. I think there is a world where Myles Rice doesn't have a good game, but Indiana still wins. I don't think it's a make or break. But certainly it would, if Chucky has a really good game defensively, Louisville's going to be in a much better spot, just because of their ability to then get out and transition. Um, it probably means that they're not getting the ball into the post much if IU's guards are turning it over, because they had some really sloppy entry passes and stuff against UNC Greensboro. That was a problem for them, turnovers, especially in that game. So certainly that matchup is one to watch.
And I guess, Indiana's bench depth is something you'd think would help Indiana in this kind of 3 games in 3 days. But so far this year, the bench maybe hasn't been as impressive. I know Galloway's still working back from the injury. Goody hasn't found his stroke, and Indiana's dealt with injuries left and right. But how do you kind of see Indiana's bench making an impact, and how do you see it comparing to the guys Louisville brings off?
Two deep teams. I mean, these are two pretty deep teams. Louisville's had a couple injuries as well. Corin Johnson, transfer backup point guard, um, has missed the past couple games. Abubakar Traore isn't going to play this week because he broke his arm a week ago in practice, and he started the first couple games for Louisville, and he's kind of like a Swiss Army knife type player that can kind of do it all, good defender. So they've missed them. But it's kind of been this next man up mentality. And for Indiana, again, with Galloway coming off the bench, we've seen what Bryson Tucker can do. He scored 14 points against UNC Greensboro the other night. He's really solid. And Luke Goody, I just feel like it's only a matter of time before he sees the ball go in. I think a change of scenery will honestly help him. I think sometimes when you're shooting in the same gym every game, you can kind of get in your head about it. And Indiana hasn't played away from Assembly Hall since that exhibition against Tennessee. So I think it's only a matter of time before his shot starts to go in. But again, these are two really deep teams. They're going to be able to go 8 guys deep, potentially even 9 on Louisville's side. So I don't. I think it's pretty even in that regard. Louisville's been able to get a lot of scoring production off their bench with Pryor coming off the bench, and alongside Rain Smith as well, who I mentioned earlier. Um, but Indiana's bench with Galloway coming off there, and I don't know how long he'll last coming off the bench. I know I think it's a little bit cloudy what's going on with his knee right now and the injury. He hasn't played more than I think like 22 minutes in a game yet this year. So we'll have to see if he's even in game shape to be able to go that deep. So I think if it is tight come late, Indiana could run into a problem where, maybe they've got a minutes restriction on Galloway or something, and he's running out of gas, and they haven't played in a close game all year, and so it'll be interesting to see how that one pans out in terms of the depth.
Yeah, 22 minutes, the most for Galloway this year,
Yeah.
17, 18, 14 in the other three. So we just haven't seen him quite yet. Obviously, the winner of this game gets the winner of Gonzaga and West Virginia. Obviously, the Zags a top 5 team, and then on the bottom side, Arizona's the big prize over there. Even though they have struggled so far, already with 2 losses. I guess for you, kind of obviously for either team here, what's kind of best case scenario in this tournament? three games in 3 days. Obviously, a ton of this will ride. A ton of what happens here will kind of be viewed as Indiana's non-conference schedule with all the other
Right.
bye games. So, what does Indiana need to get out of this week?
Well, you mentioned it. I think Indiana, partly why winning this first game against Louisville is so huge for them, Austin, is because they don't have the other opportunities on their non-conference schedule to pick up marquee wins. I mean, they scheduled the South Carolina game and they beat them by 16. It's I don't think that's not impressive, but it's not that it doesn't have that name brand, that kind of buzz to it. Um, and if they are to beat Louisville, getting put on the winner side of the bracket where you will potentially face a Gonzaga, you will potentially face an Arizona, even a Providence. Teams like that, it's really going to bolster their non-conference strength of schedule because elsewhere they just don't have the opportunities. On Louisville's side, they do have a stellar non-conference schedule. They've got the game against Kentucky. They had the game against Tennessee. They've got the game against Ole Miss in the ACC SEC Challenge. Ole Miss was a top 25 preseason team. So, they have some opportunities coming up where they're going to be able to pick up some, marquee non-conference wins. They've also got Duke and North Carolina all in December and January. Um, but for Indiana, I mean, if you lose to Louisville, then you're on the loser side and you're playing maybe West Virginia and then maybe like a Davidson or a Oklahoma. It's just not, those are not, and even if they win those games kind of handily, that's not a lot for the committee to kind of work off of when it comes to seeding in March. So I think a strong performance for IU, in particular, winning the first game. Doesn't matter. You could lose to Gonzaga, by 4 or 5 and you've still got that game on your schedule and then maybe you'll play Arizona the next day or and have another opportunity. But if you start off poorly, lose to Louisville, get put on the loser side of the bracket, it's going to be a problem for Indiana in come March. And I think it could cost them a seed line even, when it comes to that. So again, it's a huge tournament for both teams, but I think it might be even more important for IU, in particular, to kind of build that non-conference resume, and even build some momentum too. This is a really talented IU team that certainly has a chance to win the battle for Atlantis. I think Gonzaga, a lot of teams have played them tough. Arizona State played them really tough, and Arizona, like you said, has not been as impressive as people thought. So it's a big time opportunity for both teams, but in IU's case, they've got to stack up some of these marquee non-conference games.
Hoping to get two ranked teams in there, at least one, because that
Right.
is the bare minimum you definitely need on the schedule. That's a good point you make. An entire C line could be on the line, and obviously this depends on how good the Big Ten is. Last year, obviously, wasn't as strong as it shapes up to be this year. On the addition of four new teams, that certainly changes things. Durham, any final thoughts before we are, as we're recording this, less than like 20 hours from tip?
Yeah.
Nice little noon tip on ESPN. And maybe some early games potentially for IU on the schedule, but I guess your final thoughts before the battle for Atlantis.
I think it's going to be a really, I think it's going to be a really good game. I don't see it being a blowout either way. I think Ken Palm has IU by 3. I think that honestly sounds about right, to me. I do think Indiana is the more talented team on paper. They should win, but the stylistic differences in the two teams, it makes for a really intriguing matchup in terms of how the game is going to work out. I think there's going to be a lot of games within the game, if that makes any sense, in terms of how the rotations work out and just matchups on the floor. The one-on-one matchup, with Myles Rice and Chucky Hepburn, we mentioned it's going to be exciting. So really good matchup for both teams. Critical in terms of the non-conference schedule for IU. And it's Indiana Louisville, right? Two of the more historic programs in college basketball. It's feast week. 3 games in 3 days in the battle for Atlantis, one of the better tournaments of the non-conference season. So it's a great it's a great litmus test for both squads, and I think it's going to be a good next 3 days of basketball.
We are certainly hoping so, and we're hoping all the best for IU. Term, thanks a lot for taking the time. Happy Thanksgiving, and enjoy tomorrow, no matter what happens. And hopefully, wink, wink, IU wins, and we can go forward and not have to worry about it.
Thank you, Austin. Appreciate that, and happy Thanksgiving to you as well. Thanks for having me on.
That'll wrap it up here for the House of Hoosier. We'll be back after Thanksgiving to recap the battle for Atlantis and look at the rest of IU's non-conference schedule. For Durham and for Ian Plaskoff,